Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about gobos and shadows. So what we have here is a photograph of the shadow cast by a beautiful tree. So a shadow is clearly the part where light is obscured by a solid, an opaque or semi-opaque object, or an object that light can't pass through. Um, and If I were to create a scene, supposing I created this field and then I want to cast this shadow, I would have to either import a tree or build a tree and place it between the light and the scene so that it casts a realistic shadow, or find some alternate way of doing it. So it's that alternative way that we're going to look at today, because obviously importing everything that you want to cast a shadow, whilst physically accurate, can be quite an expensive way of creating a scene in terms of processor time. So what we're going to do is look at gobos. So what is a gobo? A gobo is a filter, if you like, that goes in between a light and the the place that it's shining. So what we have here is a cluster of disco lights, and each of them has a gobo over the top. In this case, in fact, we have these different gobos here. These are all designed to go in front of lights. I think they're made of wood, and then they just mount in front of a light. But in this particular case, they also probably have a gel filter, like photographers use them sometimes. It's like a piece of plastic that's coloured. So there'd be a piece of coloured plastic, and then a gobo. And then when the light shines, it's obscured by the black bits, and the coloured gel changes the colour of the light, and you get this interesting effect. And you can see here there's some kind of word, so quite often that's used for marketing at events to shine coloured lights and brand names and things up on buildings. So what we're going to be looking at here, here's another effect that we can use for a gobo in a minute. So what we're going to be looking at is a way to use the effect of a gobo on a poser light. Now that's been built in for quite some time into poser, for as long as I can remember, in fact. And let me just show you something here. So this scene here is called Hacienda Hermosa, and it has a Terradome sky background, back from when RDNA was still a thing. RIP. That was a great store. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to render this scene in Superfly. So optics engine, Superfly, low number of samples, high bucket size, so it renders quickly. And there's a scene. The lighting's far from perfect. I would tune it a lot. Speaking of which, here's the default lighting for this scene. The scene actually came with a set of lights. And anytime you see a set of lights like this, and they're not simply illuminating lamps and lanterns and things like this, when they're lights all around the scene, spotlights, for example, excuse me, what it usually means is that it's an older scene where the artist is trying to simulate what's known as global illumination. And global illumination is a way of creating light in the way that Snarly Gribbly's what's it called? Easy Dome creates a sky dome around your scene, and then that sky dome actually, each pixel of the sky dome is treated as a light generator, and it creates a much more natural 360-degree light. Well, in the old days, you couldn't do that sort of thing. There was no ambient light in Poser. So what people did was they just created many lights, sometimes dozens, even hundreds of lights around the scene, that all came in from different angles and simulated global illumination. The only trouble is that back in the day when they first started doing it, it took an awful long time to calculate the ray trace on every single light. So most people just didn't bother doing it. But if you ever see a cluster of lights like this, that's most likely what's going on if it's an old scene. So anyway, what we've done is we've rendered this scene in Superfly engine, the new default for Poser 11 and Poser 12. And it looks okay. The lights could be adjusted better. But now look what happens when I render it in Firefly. So we've got these really interesting shadows there. And now you can imagine, obviously I've put basically a woodland shadow on the walls here. So imagine we've got a low light, maybe it's dawn or evening, a low light over here somewhere, and it's shining through the trees and creating these wonderful, interesting shadows here. Or, for example, imagine another scene where it's a detective's office and the light is coming through a window in front of him and casting on the wall behind. You know, that classic film noir kind of look. I'll see if I can add an example here as a cut in. So why did that do that in Firefly, but it didn't do it here in Superfly? Well, that brings me to a really interesting response that I had to a video by Nerd 3D. So the video was asking why lights were not casting properly in a scene and previewing properly in a scene with ambient light. And he explained why for numerous reasons to do with Superfly being broken. But at the bottom, ironically, I was making a video about gobos, and he also said, also for your information, using a gobo is presently broken for Superfly. It will produce bizarre, distorted results. This is a known issue and has been looked at. Well, to be honest, it's obviously been broken for at least 2 versions of Superfly, so they need to get their finger out. But still, fingers crossed they'll do a Poser 13 that creates a lot of that resolves a lot of these poor lighting issues. But for now, excuse me, for now, let me just show you how I did this. So the light that's there's all of these lots of lights, but the one I'm interested in is a light called trees. And if I go into the material room, you'll see here that we've got the light, but then I can plug in an image map into the color space of that light. So in this particular case, I use this forest shadow kind of map, and I'll show you that here. So I just did a Google search on forest silhouette, and here's the silhouette here. Now it's loaded black. Do you know why that's done that? It's very important that you understand that, because it's going to come into things in a minute, because I'm going to give you a fix that works with Superfly so that we can still cast shadows or gobos. Look at this file format. If you can see where the cursor is, PNG. And then I recreated it as a PSD Photoshop. And the reason for that is because I had to, a PNG had a transparent layer here. If I turn the background off, can you see that transparency denoted by these grey and white checkers? So that means that where it's not black here, where it's grey or white like that, it's transparent. And that's really, really useful in some situations, but for creating gobos, it doesn't work. Poser doesn't recognize the transparency properly. So what I had to do was go into Photoshop, but you could use Photo Paint or one of the other image editors, and then I just created a layer underneath, and Poser actually recognizes Photoshop as an image format, but if it didn't, I could have just flattened that down and then saved that as a JPEG here, JPEG format, which is actually what I did. So if I now return to my scene, you'll see now that that image is plugged into the light, and it basically acts as a gobo. So the light now shines through this. That doesn't work right. So what I've done is I've added that to an infinite light here. So an infinite light is a light that has no origin point. Essentially, it shines. In this case, if you can just about see the light indicators here. That the light is. Let me see if I can just show you with the shadows. I'll turn shadows on. So here's the shadow. So you can see the direction that the light's coming from. An infinite light basically shines parallel lines of light. They don't come from a single point like a spotlight and radiate outwards. They come from a single um, uh, from an infinite distance away, and all of the lines are parallel to each other. So what you do is you get a nice even lighting, a bit like daylight basically. And now if I did a spotlight or any of the others, well, except diffuse, what you do is you get light radiating from wherever the light was located. However, you can put a gobo on a spotlight. I'm not sure if you can do it on a point light or an area light, but certainly a spotlight. The only trouble is that you get distorted shadows, so you're better off to do it on an infinite light for this kind of stuff. And if you're trying to do, say, well, those disco lights, for example, it makes more sense to put them on a spotlight. So what we have here is a scene that works in Firefly. So Firefly, in case you're not aware, was the previous poser PBR rendering engine. Oh, well, actually, it wasn't PBR, it was a weighted rendering engine. PBR is physically based rendering, and what it means is that the rendering engine that Poser uses under Superfly is trying to mimic the properties of real materials. So if that stone was set up properly, it would look like real stone. The glass on these lanterns would behave properly like glass. They would deflect the light and that kind of thing. But before that, it had the Firefly engine, which didn't do that. It kind of simulated it, but it didn't really do a good job of it. But in the Superfly rendering engine, it doesn't recognize gobos, as Nerd3D said. So when I render with that infinite light on, with the gobo on the top, it doesn't create the effect that we're looking for. But there is a way to simulate that. So let me show you that. So what I've created is a prop here. So this is definitely not going to look as good, only because I couldn't spend ages and ages messing about with it. But what I have here is a plane. So let me go to my auxiliary camera here. I've got a plane. Okay, is that single-sided? Yeah, it's a single-sided plane, but it doesn't matter. It would work if it's double-sided. So I loaded a plane from the Poser primitives, and then I applied to this cloth plane, I applied an image map to the transparency, but I inverted the image map. So the one that I plugged into the infinite light was black where I wanted shadows and white where I wanted transparency. On this one, I inverted it in Photoshop. So what I did was I flattened these two out. So I'll just do flatten image here, then Control I, and that inverts it and gives me like a nightmare version of the image. And then I use that as my image here. And here's the really important part. So it's plugged. Oh, actually, let me just talk about a couple more things in materials first. So it's plugged into transparency. So what I did was I did new node. So I right clicked on space, new node, 2D textures, image map, and that called up this window. Then I just loaded the image map here, image source, and then I selected it there. Then I plugged that in by dragging to the transparency plug here. Turn the transparency to 1, but there's 2 more steps that you'll need to do. First of all, you need to turn transparency fall off to 0, and the other is you need to turn specular to 0. Either of those, if left at their higher values, I think this is defaults to 1 and this defaults to 0.6, will create a shine even where it's supposed to be transparent. So I've now created this panel and I stretched it big enough to get in the way of the scene. And here's the last thing that you need to do. Go into the properties for cloth plane. So I could have renamed that trees or shadow or whatever. And turn off visible in camera. That's a really, really important bit. So now when I go to here, even though I can see it in my preview camera, when I now render that in Superfly, just checking that I'm in Superfly, yes. When I now render that, I'll turn that up to 5, which is not all that high. in theory, the image should be invisible, but the trees, here we go, and they've cast shadows. Now, I would probably want to see, you can see where that kind of, where the edge of that is here. So I probably want to lift that up a little bit. Let's take my cloth plane and lift it higher. Let's try that again. Hopefully this is going to be a bit higher now. And you also may have to mess around with the scaling as well. But you can see that essentially I've created the same effect in Superfly. Even though gobos don't work, you can still use transparency to create the same effect. So that can be a very useful little trick. Now let me show you another example, another use case. So don't need to save that. What I do need to do is do gobo lighting. So what we have here is an ancient gentleman's nightclub, this is called. And it's an interesting one because it works equally well in Superfly and in Firefly. What they've done is tried to create some kind of pole dancing club. It's a very, very old set. I've never used it. I don't even know it's actually why it's in my library. But anyway, that's that's another matter. But what they've done, let me just turn off that light a sec. So we've got lights here. So I'm in the material room. I've got gobo light, and I'm just gonna. Okay, so that's called gobo light. I'm just going to turn that off entirely. Right. So this is the default lighting for this set. See, it's having to render every. Oh, it's another one that's got probably global illumination of some sort, low level kind of global illumination. Certainly, the lighting doesn't require that many lights. It's not like it's casting wonderful shadows everywhere. Now, what sort of light was that? Firefly or Superfly? Okay, it was Firefly. So if I go to Superfly and render that, much quicker. But again, no lighting. Now I haven't set up a shadow light for this time, but what they've done, it's a bit of a fake. If you compare the two images, it's a very nasty fake actually. Here's the Firefly image, and here's the Superfly image. Tiny bit of brightness, but you see these weird patterns here. What they've done is tried to simulate spotlight interference patterns in the lighting in the actual texture. So if I click here and then click on the material, open up this material, and you'll see it's kind of splodgy, and it's a really, really crappy way of accomplishing what they're trying to do. A far better way, and that kind of tells me that this was before you could have gobo lights. A far better way was to go into the materials, choose lights. Here's my gobo light. That's plugged in. So I've plugged in that pattern into my lights. And this time I think I'm using a spotlight, which is more realistic for this type of light. And then I'm just going to turn that on. And oh, that won't work because I'm in Superfly. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Firefly. Render that. I think the bucket size is small for this one, so it's not going to render quite so quickly. See, adding all of those lights, and it would have been even worse. There we go. Look at this lovely, lovely pattern now. So that pattern is cast by a gobo light that does this pattern. So this is now used as a light. Let me just return to here, so as you can see that one to finish. So there's just some ideas for you on different types of gobo lighting and different uses. So you can use it to create shadows, and you can use it to cast interesting lighting into your scene. This version tends to work only works in Firefly for now, but the version with the transparency works with Superfly as well. Unfortunately, with Superfly, it's a bit more awkward to project colors into the scene as well. I could imagine a way that you could do that with layered transparency and have the non-occluded bits as a color map. But I'm just thinking on the fly now. Anyway, hopefully you found that interesting, guys, and I will speak to you later.